The school bell rang, its shrill chime echoing down the empty halls, signaling the start of third period. The classroom buzzed with the usual mixture of noise and restlessness that accompanied the beginning of another day. Students filed into Mr. Carter's advanced placement calculus class, some chatting with friends, others focused on their notebooks, trying to prepare themselves for the inevitable struggle that was the day's lesson. As always, the room smelled faintly of stale coffee and the dry scent of chalk. The walls, covered in equations and complex graphs, stood as silent witnesses to the tension that filled the space. It was the kind of room where students would sit in quiet dread, glancing up at the intimidating board, their minds already preparing for the intellectual battle ahead. Mr. Carter, the teacher at the helm, was known for his sharp wit and even sharper sarcasm. His thick glasses perched on the edge of his nose, eyes scanning the room like a hawk searching for prey. He wasn't just a teacher to the students. He was a force, a challenge, a reminder that AP Calculus was not for the faint of heart. He was the kind of teacher who thrived on intellectual superiority, often throwing curveballs at his students to keep them on their toes, ensuring that no one would ever feel truly comfortable in his class. Yet today there was something different in the air. Mr. Carter had a glint in his eye, an idea forming in his mind that, unbeknownst to the students, would change everything. As the bell's final chime faded into the distance, he stood at the front of the classroom, arms crossed, waiting for the students to settle. His voice, cool and calculating, broke the silence. "All right, class, I think it's time to solve this beast," he said, gesturing to the complex calculus problem on the board. The equation, already intimidating to the students, seemed to mock them as they looked at it, each person trying to make sense of its convoluted symbols and impossible-to-follow steps. They had been working on it for days, but it still didn't make sense. Most of the class groaned, some slouched lower in their seats, trying to hide behind the papers in front of them, already defeated by the challenge. The struggle was real, and the frustration was palpable. Mr. Carter smiled inwardly, sensing the opportunity. "You know what," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Maybe Ruth can help us out today." The students turned their heads, confused. Ruth? Who was Ruth? The name barely registered with most of them. And then they saw her, standing by the door with a mop in her hand, quietly going about her business as she did every day. Ruth Jenkins, the school janitor. To the students, she was little more than a background figure, a kindly woman who swept the floors, wiped down desks, and kept the school looking clean. She had been here for years, long before any of them had enrolled, but they never paid her any mind. She was, in their eyes, part of the scenery, nothing more. Mr. Carter, however, was enjoying the moment. He knew exactly what he was doing. "Ruth," he called out, his tone carrying just the right amount of mockery. "How about you give this a try? I'm sure you've seen enough math around here to solve this little problem." Laughter rippled through the classroom. The students exchanged glances, chuckling at the absurdity of the suggestion. Ruth, the janitor, solving a complex calculus equation. It seemed ridiculous, even laughable. After all, she was just an elderly woman, soft-spoken and unassuming, with hands that showed the wear and tear of years of hard work. She had always been polite and kind, but no one had ever thought of her as anything more than the woman who kept the school running behind the scenes. But Ruth didn't flinch. She stood still for a moment, her mop held loosely in her hand, the sound of it squeaking faintly against the floor. She hadn't fully understood the joke, but she sensed the mockery in the air. She had heard it before, countless times, the way people underestimated her, dismissed her because of her age, her job, her quiet demeanor. Life had often placed her in situations where she had been overlooked, ignored, and underestimated. It had been that way for years. But Ruth knew something that no one else did. She wasn't just the janitor. She wasn't just the old woman who cleaned the halls. Ruth Jenkins had been someone else once, a long time ago. She had been one of the brightest students in her class at a prestigious university, her intellect revered by professors and peers alike. She had excelled in mathematics and science, in everything she touched. But life had a way of steering her down a different path. The pressure of family obligations, the need for financial stability, and the demands of life had pulled her away from her studies and pushed her into a career that, while respectable, was far removed from the world of numbers and equations. But not today. Today, something inside Ruth stirred. She had been silent for too long, hiding a part of herself that had been buried under years of assumptions and dismissals. It was time to show them. It was time to remind them that she was more than they thought. With a steady breath, Ruth set her mop aside. The class fell silent, unsure of what to expect. Mr. Carter's grin widened, thinking she would shy away, that she would simply laugh along with them. But Ruth's resolve was clear. She wasn't backing down. She walked toward the front of the room, each step measured and deliberate. The students fell into an uneasy silence, their eyes fixed on her, some still chuckling, unsure whether they were witnessing a moment of complete absurdity or something else entirely. Ruth reached the chalkboard and picked up a piece of chalk. The sound of the chalk scratching against the board seemed to amplify in a quiet room, a sharp contrast to the laughter that had preceded it. For a brief moment, she hesitated, her mind racing. She had solved problems like this before, many, many times. The skills she had once honed were still there, buried beneath the years of mopping floors and scrubbing toilets. She closed her eyes, focusing on the numbers, the symbols, the patterns. She could do this. With a steady hand, Ruth began to write. The class watched, stunned into silence, as she deftly worked through the problem. The chalk moved with precision, solving the equation step by step. The students had expected her to falter, to give up, to walk away. But Ruth didn't stop. She moved with confidence, as if the problem was as simple as a child's puzzle. The tension in the room mounted with every stroke of the chalk. And then it happened. Ruth solved the problem. The complex equation that had stumped the class for days, the one that had defeated even the most brilliant minds in the room, was no more. The solution was right there, on the board, in front of everyone. Ruth Jenkins had done it. The room was deathly quiet. No one moved, no one spoke. The students simply stared, jaws slack in disbelief. They had witnessed something incredible, something they could never have imagined. The janitor had solved the calculus problem. Ruth Jenkins had shattered their expectations and revealed a genius that had been hidden in plain sight all along. Mr. Carter stood at the front of the room, his smug grin slowly fading. The students sat frozen, their eyes wide with shock and awe. No one knew what to say. They had underestimated Ruth, and now they had to face the consequences of their assumptions. Ruth turned toward the class, her expression calm, almost serene. "Sometimes," she said softly, "you can't judge a book by its cover." And with that, she walked out of the room, leaving a group of stunned students to contemplate the lesson they had just learned. About Ruth, about assumptions, and about the power of never underestimating someone, no matter how invisible they might seem. The silence in the classroom was deafening. Ruth Jenkins, the unassuming janitor, had just completed what seemed impossible, and yet, here she was, calmly walking away from the chalkboard. The students, still frozen in their seats, couldn't process what had just happened. The laughter, the mockery, the condescension, they all evaporated into thin air, leaving behind an uncomfortable stillness that clung to the room. Even Mr. Carter, usually so composed and self-assured, stood at the front, his mouth slightly agape as he stared at the solution Ruth had written on the board. It wasn't just the fact that she had solved the problem. After all, she was no stranger to mathematics, as they would soon find out. It was how she had done it, without hesitation, without any of the stumbling or second-guessing they had expected. Ruth had approached the problem with an ease and precision that no one had anticipated. The simplicity with which she had solved the equation stunned everyone. Ruth Jenkins wasn't just the janitor. She was a force, a quiet storm that had been overlooked for far too long. And in that moment, Her actions spoke louder than any words could. She had just shattered every preconceived notion they had about her life, and about who she was. The students, still processing the events, began to stir. Some of them exchanged hesitant glances. Others slowly turned their gaze back to the chalkboard, as if to convince themselves that what they had witnessed wasn't a figment of their collective imagination. But the equation was still there, clearly solved, a testimony to Ruth's brilliance. There was no denying it. What had just happened was real. After a long pause, it was one of the students who broke the silence, a boy named James. He was known for being outspoken and quick with his comments, but today, his usual confidence was nowhere to be found. He had been the loudest in mocking Ruth before, laughing along with the rest of the class at the absurdity of her being asked to solve the problem. But now he was different. His voice wavered slightly as he spoke. "How did you?" His words trailed off as he struggled to find the right way to phrase his question. It wasn't just about how Ruth had solved the problem. It was about what it meant. James had been one of the top students in the class, and yet he had been stumped by the equation for days. And now, here was Ruth Jenkins, the janitor, the person he had barely noticed before, solving it with ease. Ruth didn't immediately respond. She simply smiled softly, a glimmer of something like understanding in her eyes. The rest of the class remained silent, waiting for her to explain, to say something that would make sense of what had just happened. But Ruth wasn't the type to explain herself. She wasn't interested in being praised or recognized. Her whole life had been about remaining in the background, doing her job, staying out of the spotlight. And yet, today, she had stepped into that light. Unintentionally, yes, but she had stepped into it nonetheless. And now that the spotlight was on her, she wasn't going to dance for anyone. "I had to clean a lot of classrooms in my time," she said simply, her voice low and steady, "and sometimes, while I was mopping, I'd look at the equations on the boards. It made me curious. I wanted to understand them, so I did. Just like that." Her answer was so understated, so matter-of-fact, that it left the class even more stunned. She hadn't done anything special. She had just learned, like anyone else could. The idea that anyone, could take the time to learn something purely out of curiosity, without any expectation of reward, was almost foreign to the students. They had been taught to study for grades, for recognition, for achievements. But Ruth, it seemed, had learned for the sake of learning itself. For the first time, Mr. Carter spoke, his voice now stripped of the sarcasm that had once defined him. "Ruth, I had no idea." His words were genuine, his tone a little softer than usual, a bit more humbled. The realization was beginning to dawn on him too. "You never asked," Ruth replied, turning to face him for the first time since she had solved the equation. Her gaze was steady, not accusatory, just matter-of-fact. "None of you ever asked." The class was still processing the weight of those words when Ruth continued. "When you work as a janitor, you get used to being invisible. You do your job, and you leave. People don't really notice you. But that's okay. I didn't need anyone to notice me. I just wanted to keep learning, even if it was on my own." The students shifted in their seats, their eyes no longer filled with the dismissiveness that had previously defined their interactions with her. Ruth wasn't just a janitor. She was a reminder of what it meant to never stop growing, to never stop learning, no matter the circumstances. For the first time in a long while, the students felt a twinge of discomfort, not because they were embarrassed or ashamed, but because Ruth had forced them to confront something they had never really considered before: the danger of assumptions. They had assumed that because Ruth was a janitor, because she was older, because she kept to herself, she didn't have anything valuable to offer. They had assumed that the roles people played in life defined their potential. But Ruth had just proved them wrong in the most powerful way possible. As the class continued to sit in silence, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air, Mr. Carter cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "I think we all learned something today," he said, his voice now a little softer, almost reflective. "And Ruth, thank you. for showing us that intelligence doesn't always come in the form we expect. Ruth nodded, a small smile crossing her lips, though it was clear she wasn't looking for validation. She wasn't looking for any recognition. For her, this wasn't about proving something to anyone. It was about reminding herself of who she was, of who she had once been. And maybe, just maybe, about giving the students a glimpse of something they hadn't seen before. Sometimes, she said, the world doesn't give you a chance to show what you're really capable of. But if you keep pushing, if you keep learning, even when no one's watching, you'll surprise yourself. With that, she turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind a room full of students who would never forget what they had just witnessed. As the door clicked shut behind her, a few of the students began to stir, exchanging looks, their minds racing. They had come to school that day expecting the same routine, same lessons, same struggles, but they had gotten something far more valuable. They had gotten a lesson in humility, in never underestimating someone, and in the quiet strength that could be found in the most unexpected places. And as Ruth Jenkins continued with her work, mopping the floors and cleaning the classrooms as she had always done, the students of Mr. Carter's AP Calculus class were left with a new understanding of what it meant to be more than what others saw, a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The days that followed Ruth Jenkins' extraordinary demonstration in Mr. Carter's class were filled with a quiet transformation. The atmosphere at the school, especially in the calculus classroom, felt different. At first, it was subtle, a kind of lingering respect that was unspoken but palpable. The students, who had once casually dismissed Ruth as just another part of the school's backdrop, began to see her in a new light. There was something almost reverent in the way they looked at her now. It wasn't that they suddenly wanted to sit down and discuss complex equations with her, nor was it that they sought her out for her expertise. It was more than that. They began to understand the quiet power she possessed, the kind of power that doesn't announce itself, but simply exists. Ruth wasn't someone who craved attention, but she had earned a kind of quiet awe, one that lingered long after her brief moment in the spotlight. James, the outspoken student who had been among the loudest in mocking Ruth's earlier challenge, found himself wrestling with a different kind of discomfort. He had always prided himself on his intellectual prowess, his ability to grasp even the most difficult concepts. But now, he couldn't help but feel a shift in how he viewed himself. How could he, someone who had always believed that success was defined by achievement and recognition, reconcile his image with the image of Ruth Jenkins, the janitor who had quietly walked into that classroom and solved the problem no one else could? At first, he pushed the thought away, telling himself that Ruth had just been lucky, that it had been a fluke. But deep down, he knew better. What Ruth had done couldn't be dismissed so easily. She had solved the problem because she was smart. She had simply chosen to keep her intelligence hidden, away from prying eyes, for reasons that no one else knew or understood. James couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was missing, something about Ruth, something about life, that he hadn't fully grasped. For weeks after the incident, he found himself replaying the moment in his mind, trying to piece together how it all happened. He had watched as Ruth walked to the chalkboard with a calm confidence that had seemed out of place for someone who was usually invisible. The way her chalk moved across the board was almost mesmerizing. It was as if she were tracing the path of her own quiet genius, revealing layers of herself that had been buried for years. James thought about it more than he cared to admit. He began to wonder, what would it take to be as confident as Ruth, to simply exist and let your actions speak louder than your words? As for Ruth, life returned to its routine. She continued her work at the school, mopping the floors, cleaning the classrooms, and maintaining the hallways that so many students and teachers passed through each day. But the students, even those who had once ignored her completely, began to acknowledge her presence in subtle ways. They would nod as they passed by her in the halls, some even offering a quiet "good morning" or hello that they had never extended before. It was as if they now understood that Ruth was more than the janitor. She was someone who had lived a life that they couldn't fully comprehend, but that they respected nonetheless. One afternoon, a few weeks after the calculus class incident, James found himself walking down the hallway towards the janitor's closet. He had been carrying a stack of books, preparing to leave school for the day, when he noticed Ruth in the corner of his eye. She was sweeping the floors outside one of the classrooms, her movements steady and practiced. There was a quiet dignity in the way she worked, a calm that James found strangely comforting. On a sudden impulse, he stopped in his tracks. He wasn't sure why, but something about that moment felt significant. He had seen Ruth countless times before, always working in the background, her presence almost ghost-like. But now, there was a strange urge inside him, a desire to understand her, to know more about the person who had not only solved a complicated calculus problem, but had, in a way, changed the way he saw the world. "Hi, Ruth," James said awkwardly, stepping toward her. It was the first time he had ever spoken to her outside of the classroom, and the words felt foreign on his tongue. Ruth looked up, a gentle smile spreading across her face. "Well, hello, James," she said, her voice warm and steady. "How are you today?" "I'm good, thanks. I just wanted to ask you something," he said, his words coming out a bit more hurriedly than he intended. "About the calculus problem. You know, the one you solved." Ruth paused her sweeping, looking at him with a glint of curiosity in her eyes. "What about it?" James hesitated, unsure how to phrase his question. "Well, I've been thinking about it. About how you just did it, you know." He ran a hand through his hair, still struggling to find the right words. "How did you know how to solve it? I mean, it wasn't just luck, right? You're smart. Like, really smart." Ruth smiled again, this time a little more knowingly. "Thank you, James," she said softly. "But it wasn't luck. It's just something I've learned over time. It's not about being smart. It's about being willing to learn, even when no one is watching. To pay attention to the little things. Sometimes you can find answers in the places you least expect them." James nodded slowly, absorbing her words. It wasn't the answer he had been expecting, but somehow it made perfect sense. Ruth hadn't been trying to impress anyone. She had just been quietly observing the world around her, paying attention, learning in her own way. And in doing so, she had uncovered a truth that the rest of them had missed. Learning wasn't about accolades or recognition. It was about the pursuit of knowledge, the simple act of wanting to understand, no matter who was watching or where you were. For a brief moment, there was a silence between them. James felt an unfamiliar weight in the air, a weight that was both comforting and humbling. He realized, in that moment, that Ruth had taught him something far more valuable than the calculus equation she had solved. She had shown him that intelligence didn't come with a title or a position in life. It came from within, from the quiet drive to understand the world, and from the courage to continue learning, even when others weren't looking. Ruth picked up her broom again, the soft sound of the bristles sweeping across the floor filling the silence. "Don't forget, James," she said quietly. "Learning never stops. You just have to keep going." James stood there for a moment, watching her work. It wasn't the way he had imagined this conversation would go, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. Ruth had, in her own subtle way, given him a lesson in humility, in perseverance, and in the quiet strength that often goes unnoticed. As he walked away, he felt a new sense of clarity, an understanding that intelligence wasn't something to be flaunted or held over others. It was something personal, something you carried with you, quietly and without fanfare. And for the first time in a long time, James felt a deep appreciation for the lessons Ruth had unknowingly shared with him. When he reached the end of the hallway, he looked back at Ruth, still sweeping with her steady, methodical rhythm. She hadn't changed. She was still the same kind and unassuming woman she had always been. But now James saw her differently. He saw her not just as the janitor, but as a person who had quietly embraced her own potential, despite the world's inability to recognize it. And as he stepped outside into the cool air, He couldn't help but feel a little different himself. The world seemed a bit wider, a bit more open. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to stop looking for recognition and start looking for the learning in every moment, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. And perhaps, just perhaps, he would find that, like Ruth, he had a genius within him waiting to be discovered. As the weeks continued to pass, the once uneventful days at the school began to feel like something more significant. Ruth Jenkins had unintentionally opened a door that no one had even known existed. The class of students that had once been content to dismiss her as just the janitor were now asking themselves deeper questions. They had witnessed something extraordinary in that calculus classroom, something that had not just changed their perception of Ruth, but had begun to change the way they looked at everything around them. For Ruth, however, life carried on as usual. She continued her duties with the same quiet grace she always had, her presence blending seamlessly into the background. She showed up early in the mornings, worked diligently throughout the day, and left when the final bell rang, her mop and broom becoming as familiar to the school as the classroom desks or the ticking of the clock. The students, in their own ways, began to notice her more, not just as the woman who cleaned up after them, but as someone who had a kind of wisdom they had never imagined. One afternoon, a few weeks after her unexpected calculus lesson, Ruth found herself standing in the hall, her back slightly aching from a long day of cleaning the classrooms. She had just finished wiping down the counters in the teacher's lounge when she overheard a conversation between two students. They were standing near the lockers, talking in hushed voices, but Ruth, her hearing still sharp despite her age, caught the gist of their words. "I swear, after what happened with Mrs. Jenkins, I've started thinking about my own life differently," one of them, Sarah, said. "I used to think that only the smart kids mattered. You know, the ones who ace every test, get into all the best colleges. But Ruth, she made me realize that intelligence isn't about what you show the world. It's about what you know, and how you live with it, even when no one notices." Her heart gave a slight lurch. Ruth hadn't expected to hear anyone say her name so thoughtfully, so respectfully. It was humbling to realize that the ripple effect of that one small moment, the moment when she had stepped up to the chalkboard, had reached places she hadn't even imagined. She wasn't seeking attention, and certainly not praise, but hearing Sarah's words felt like a validation of something she had always known deep inside, that the value of a person isn't in their title or their outward appearance, but in their character, their actions, and their quiet strength. Later that day, Ruth crossed paths with Sarah in the hallway. The young girl had been looking at her, almost as if she wanted to say something, but hadn't known how to approach. Ruth smiled gently as she walked by, and Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking. Mrs. Jenkins," Sarah began, her voice almost shy. "I just wanted to say, thank you for everything you did. You really made me think about a lot of things differently." Ruth stopped and turned toward her, a warm smile forming on her face. "You're welcome, Sarah, but remember, it's not about me. It's about what you do with what you've learned." Sarah nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I'm going to try to learn for the sake of learning, not just for the grades. You know, the way you did." Ruth simply nodded in return, her heart swelling with pride for this student she had barely known, now standing before her with a sense of purpose that had been ignited by her quiet example. For days after, the conversations continued to shift. It wasn't just the students who were talking about Ruth. Teachers, too, began to take notice. They began to see her not as a background figure, but as someone who carried herself with an air of wisdom and grace. They remembered the days when they had seen her sit quietly in the back of the teacher's lounge, reading books, observing the world around her, never speaking unless spoken to. What they hadn't realized was that Ruth had been taking everything in, absorbing the world with a quiet intensity. It was as if, all these years, Ruth had been waiting for the moment when the world would finally notice that she wasn't just a janitor. One teacher, Mrs. Lawrence, who taught English, approached Ruth one afternoon while she was sweeping the halls. "I've been thinking about something," Mrs. Lawrence said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "What you did in that calculus class was remarkable. You never once told anyone that you had been a student yourself, that you were once the one solving those kinds of problems." Ruth looked up from her sweeping, her expression calm and neutral. "Some things are better left unsaid," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken experiences. "I've learned over the years that not everything needs to be shared. Sometimes, the work itself speaks louder than words ever could." Mrs. Lawrence nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's what's most amazing about you, Ruth. You've taught everyone that you don't need to flaunt what you know. You just need to be true to yourself. And that's enough." Ruth didn't say anything in response. She simply gave Mrs. Lawrence a kind smile, the same smile that had been on her face for years. She had always been the person who did the work, quietly and diligently, without seeking recognition. But now, even as her world remained mostly unchanged, the people around her were beginning to understand the depth of who she was. The most profound change, however, came not from the recognition Ruth received from others, but from within herself. For the first time in a long while, she began to realize that she had spent so many years hiding parts of herself, thinking that her brilliance and her knowledge weren't worth sharing. She had grown accustomed to being overlooked, to being just the janitor. But now, in the eyes of her students and some of the teachers, she was someone more. She was someone who had quietly defied expectations, and maybe, just maybe, she could afford to step into the light a little more, without fear of judgment. But even as these realizations came to her, Ruth didn't change the way she worked. She still arrived early, did her job with the same meticulous care, and left at the end of the day. However, the sense of fulfillment she felt was different now. She no longer felt as though she was invisible. She had taken control of her own story, and though she may not have been the one to write the headlines, she had become a central figure in the narrative of her own life. One day, as Ruth was preparing to leave for the day, she caught a glimpse of a group of students gathered in front of the school's bulletin board. They were staring intently at something, whispering excitedly among themselves. Ruth stepped closer, curious. On the board was a handwritten note, penned by one of the students. It read, "Inspiration isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet." Ruth Jenkins, the janitor, showed us all that brilliance doesn't need to be flaunted. It just needs to be. Her heart swelled as she read the words. Ruth had never sought accolades, but here was a moment, a quiet, powerful acknowledgement that everything she had done had mattered. She had inspired without ever intending to. And in that moment, she realized that her greatest strength had always been her humility, her quiet resilience, and her unwavering commitment to learning and growing, no matter the circumstances. Ruth Jenkins had shown the world that intelligence, kindness, and wisdom don't come in the form of titles or positions. They come from within. And sometimes, the most profound lessons in life are the ones you learn when you least expect it. As the school year continued, Ruth's story took on a life of its own. She had never expected to become a figure of inspiration, but that was exactly what happened. The small, seemingly insignificant moment in the calculus classroom had sparked something in the hearts of the students and staff. It wasn't just about a math problem anymore. It was about a person who had quietly proven that the labels we place on others don't define their worth or potential. Ruth herself had begun to notice subtle changes in how the world interacted with her. Teachers, students, even the principal, began to treat her with a level of respect that hadn't been there before. It wasn't that they had started to overestimate her abilities, but they had come to appreciate her in a way they hadn't before. There was a kind of quiet reverence that surrounded her now, an acknowledgement of the strength she had shown in standing up when no one expected her to. But Ruth remained grounded, never letting the attention get to her head. She wasn't someone who needed praise or acknowledgement. All she needed was to continue doing what she had always done, working hard, quietly, and without fanfare. Yet, something inside of her had shifted. The world no longer felt as distant, as if she was simply existing in the periphery. There was a new sense of purpose, a renewed conviction in the way she approached each day. She wasn't just a janitor anymore. She was someone who had something to offer, even if it was in a form different from what others expected. One afternoon, Ruth was sitting in the small teacher's lounge, reading a book as she usually did during her break, when she was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Mrs. Lawrence, the English teacher who had often engaged Ruth in thoughtful conversations about life and literature. "Ruth, may I have a word with you?" Mrs. Lawrence asked, her tone more serious than usual. Ruth closed her book, setting it aside, and nodded, giving the teacher her full attention. "I've been thinking about something," Mrs. Lawrence said, sitting across from Ruth. "Your story, the one that spread around the school, it's inspired a lot of people. And I was wondering if you might consider doing something with it, sharing your experience with others. Maybe even starting a mentorship program for students who feel like they don't have a place or who are struggling to find their voice. You've already impacted so many with just one moment. I can't help but wonder how many more lives you could touch if you shared more of your journey." Ruth blinked, surprised by the suggestion. Mentoring, sharing her life story. It wasn't something she had ever considered. Ruth had always been someone who preferred to stay in the background, who had found comfort in being out of the spotlight. She wasn't the type of person who needed to stand at the front of the room and speak. But Mrs. Lawrence's words lingered in her mind, and a seed of curiosity began to sprout. "I don't know, Mrs. Lawrence," Ruth said softly, her voice hesitant. "I've never been one to talk about myself. I've spent most of my life working quietly, doing what needs to be done without expecting recognition. Sharing my story feels out of my comfort zone." Mrs. Lawrence smiled kindly, as if she had expected this response. "Ruth, your story is more powerful than you realize. It's not about being comfortable or not. It's about helping others see that they, too, have the power to change their own lives. It's about showing them that even when the world tells them they're not enough, they can still rise above it. Your life is a testament to that." Ruth sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Mrs. Lawrence's words sinking in. She had never thought of herself as someone with a story worth sharing. To her, she was just Ruth, the quiet woman who cleaned the school. But now, for the first time, she began to wonder, what if she did have something to offer? What if her experiences, her lessons, could help others see the potential within themselves? It was a daunting thought, but also an intriguing one. The next few days were a whirlwind of contemplation. Ruth found herself reflecting on her life in a way she hadn't done in years. She thought about her time in college, the dreams she had once had, the obstacles she had faced, and the decisions that had led her down the path she had taken. She had always believed that life had a way of guiding you to where you needed to be, even if it wasn't where you had originally intended to go. And now she found herself wondering if perhaps this was the next step in her journey, sharing the wisdom she had gained over the years with others. It was during one of these moments of reflection that Ruth decided to take a leap of faith. The next day, she spoke with Mrs. Lawrence about starting a mentorship program. Together, they outlined a plan to create a space for students who felt overlooked, for those who didn't fit the typical mold of success. The goal was to help them discover their own strengths, just as Ruth had discovered her own, through quiet persistence, through learning when no one was watching, and through believing that even the smallest of actions could make a difference. Ruth's first meeting with the group of students was a small one. Only a few students showed up, hesitant and unsure of what to expect. But as Ruth spoke, something in the room began to shift. She didn't stand in front of them as an authority figure or a teacher. She simply sat with them, sharing her story with an authenticity that only someone who had lived through hardship could convey. She spoke about her time in college, how she had been one of the top students in her class, and how life had pulled her away from her dreams. She talked about the struggles she had faced, the challenges she had overcome, and the decision she had made to keep going, even when the world seemed to tell her she wasn't enough. There was a quiet power in Ruth's words. It wasn't in her delivery, but in the honesty with which she spoke. Her vulnerability, her willingness to open up and show the students that she, too, had faced adversity, resonated deeply with them. They weren't hearing a polished speech from a teacher. They were hearing from someone who had lived through the same challenges they were facing now. Someone who had been told she wasn't good enough, but had refused to give up. As the meeting ended, Ruth felt a sense of fulfillment that she had never experienced before. For the first time, she realized that she had something to offer that went beyond cleaning floors and mopping hallways. She had a voice, a story, and the ability to make a difference. And in that moment, Ruth Jenkins, the janitor, became more than just a quiet figure in the background. She became a mentor, a guide, and an inspiration to the students who had been searching for a role model. Someone who could show them that success wasn't about what you had or where you came from. It was about resilience, courage, and the willingness to keep going, even when everything seemed stacked against you. The mentorship program grew over time, with more students attending each session. Ruth's impact began to extend far beyond the walls of the school. Word of her story spread to other schools, inspiring others to create similar programs for students who felt overlooked. But Ruth never sought out the limelight. She continued her work as the school janitor, never needing recognition for the difference she was making. She had already found her reward in the knowledge that she had helped others see their potential, just as she had seen her own. Ruth Jenkins had learned that greatness doesn't always come with accolades or titles. Sometimes it comes in the quiet moments of life, when you make the decision to rise above the circumstances you've been given and use your experiences to lift others up. In the end, it wasn't the calculus problem that had made Ruth a legend. It was the way she lived her life, with humility, resilience, and an unwavering belief that everyone has the power to change their story. As the school year neared its end, Ruth found herself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short period. It wasn't just the students' perception of her that had shifted, but her own understanding of herself and her purpose. She had spent decades in the background, taking pride in her work, but never expecting to be seen as more than just the janitor. Now, however, she had realized that the role she had played in the school community was far more significant than she had ever imagined. The mentorship program Ruth had helped establish had taken off in ways she couldn't have anticipated. What began as a small, intimate group of students who felt they didn't belong or had lost their way had turned into something bigger. It wasn't just about academic struggles or social challenges anymore. The students who came to Ruth for guidance had found something they hadn't expected: hope. And in turn, Ruth had begun to rediscover a part of herself she had thought was lost forever. The joy of helping others, of making a difference, became her new purpose. She wasn't just cleaning floors anymore. She was cleaning up the misconceptions and barriers that had once limited both her and the students who sought her advice. One afternoon, after a particularly long day, Ruth walked out of the school building, her worn sneakers softly tapping against the pavement. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm glow over the school grounds. She paused for a moment, looking out over the campus. Everything seemed so still, so peaceful. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. But change wasn't always easy, and Ruth knew this better than anyone. For all the growth she had experienced, there had also been moments of doubt. After all, she had spent decades defining herself by the work she did, not by what she was capable of beyond that work. The idea of stepping out into the spotlight, even for a good cause, had always felt uncomfortable. Yet here she was, standing on the edge of something new, something unexpected. In a way, Ruth had found her own rebirth. She had spent so many years living with the weight of unspoken dreams, watching as others seemed to soar, while she remained grounded in the day-to-day routine of cleaning and maintaining the school. But now, Ruth realized that the path she had taken had led her here, to this very moment, where her purpose wasn't defined by a job title or a classroom degree. It was defined by her actions and her willingness to share her experiences with others. That evening, as Ruth sat down to have dinner at her small apartment, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Lawrence. "Ruth, I have something I need to tell you," Mrs. Lawrence said, her voice full of excitement. "You're not going to believe this, but the school board wants to meet with you. They've heard about your work with the mentorship program, and your impact on the students. They want to offer you something. Ruth's heart skipped a beat. The school board. She had no idea what they might want, but the fact that they were even reaching out to her felt surreal. What do they want? Ruth asked, her voice hesitant. They want to recognize you. Formally, Mrs. Lawrence replied. They're considering making your mentorship program an official part of the school curriculum, and they want to offer you a role in expanding it. They're asking you to lead the program full-time next year. Ruth. Ruth sat in stunned silence for a moment, her mind racing. This was more than she had ever dreamed of. The school board wanted to offer her a role, one that would allow her to continue making the difference in the lives of students, but in a more formal capacity. It was overwhelming, but it was also a sign that her impact had reached far beyond the four walls of that calculus classroom. I don't know what to say, Ruth finally managed, her voice trembling slightly. I've never imagined something like this. Mrs. Lawrence's voice softened, filled with understanding. Ruth, you've done more than anyone could have expected. Your story, your wisdom, it's something the students need. And I know that you're the perfect person to lead this program. For the first time in years, Ruth felt a sense of clarity. The path that had once seemed so unclear was now unfolding before her. The mentorship program had become more than just a way to give back. It had become her calling. The role that the school board was offering her wasn't about recognition or accolades. It was about something much deeper. It was about creating a space where students who had been overlooked could find their own potential, just as she had. It was about helping them see that their value wasn't defined by a grade or a social status, but by their resilience, their dreams, and their ability to rise above adversity. As the days passed and the school year came to a close, Ruth found herself more at peace than she had been in a long time. The students who had once dismissed her as just the janitor had now come to see her as a mentor, a guide, and someone they could turn to when they needed help. The young people who had struggled with self-doubt, with the weight of expectations that didn't fit them, had found a safe space in her. Ruth had provided them not just with advice, but with the most powerful gift she could offer, the belief that they could change the direction of their lives, no matter the obstacles. On the last day of school, as students filed out of the building, a group of them gathered around Ruth. They thanked her for everything she had done, for the mentorship, the guidance, and the lessons she had taught them, not just about math or academics, but about life. Ruth smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She hadn't done anything extraordinary in their eyes. She had simply been herself, and in doing so, she had given them the courage to be themselves. As Ruth locked up the school for the summer, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Her journey had come full circle. From the woman who had once been unseen, working quietly in the background, to the mentor who had touched the lives of so many students, Ruth had found her voice, her purpose, and her place in the world. She had become a living testament to the power of resilience, to the idea that even the smallest actions could create ripples of change. And she knew, without a doubt, that this was just the beginning of something much larger.